Yep.
Hey everyone, so let's go into SAP HANA 101. Kind of get the baseline of the application, the history, and the components of how it works. So what we'll cover is what is S/4HANA? How do you get there? What does the migration look like, typically from on-prem to the cloud? Some of the nuanced differences between self-managed and SaaS. SaaS, I'm referring to the RISE offering with SAP. Within self-managed, we're going to go into Azure, AWS, and Google self-managed deployments for S/4HANA. And then HEC. What the heck is HEC? So kind of walk through what HEC is and was as a stopgap, and then go into the S/4HANA SaaS service types. So just like we go through the self-managed ones in Azure, AWS, and Google, and what those design patterns look like, what are the different SaaS service types that SAP offers with their RISE service? And then lastly, we'll go through how do you learn more? As we've finished off each of these sort of modules, we have references to go and dig in a little bit more about what we talked about. I see two chats. Okay, screen visible. Thank you. All right, so what is SAP? So SAP means System Applications and Products in Data Processing, SAP. So it was a group of guys about 1971, so that's almost, 50 years ago, that were IBM guys. Klaus, Hasso, Deitmer, and a couple of others worked on an internal project at IBM. And you can see over there to the right, in 72, they were kind of considered maverick engineers, right? That innovated at IBM to start and develop the SAP system. So what they built was a ERP system. And what is an ERP? It's a enterprise resource planning system, basically a management to manage business processes in real time often, and is used essentially and done with software and technology. Now, who are the folks that actually do the work, right? Who actually operate typically these ERP systems, and the technology or systems that do it, or solutions, are BASIS folks. Those BASIS stands for Business Application Software and Integrated Solutions. So that's a solution that does the management of a solution that provides management for these ERP systems. And the people that are BASIS engineers are those folks. And then there's a bit of link about history here, history of SAP, history of S/4HANA. The reason why I have this sort of 50 years of SAP is to really call to attention two main sort of inflection points with SAP. The first was in 1992. And in 92 was really when SAP moved from sort of a mainframe environment with big irons that really had these sort of big systems, big servers that were usually racks, rows and rows of systems, all sort of called one system, to a client server model. And in that client server model, that's when they released SAP R3. So that was really the first client server version of this SAP software. And IBM chose to run what was called R3 for its global operations. And why that's interesting really is a deviation from mainframe to client server, which was really the creation for, or the opportunity for, networks, right? Because with networks, for client servers to work, you need sockets and remote procedure calls, remote function calls, right? Because these individual servers, the goal of client server and socket architectures was to be able to scale out servers across the board horizontally to make it look like one big system. But to do that, fundamentally, for a socket to work, right? A socket is basically an IP address and a port number. For that to work, there needed to be a way for systems, servers, to talk to the client, and that server could be one or more servers, but the response from the server to the client made it look like it was one system. So that sort of, process, socket, and computer network combination was really what caused the evolution of, and the creation of, and the need for a network, right? Because the sockets and the servers communicating to each other to represent a socket or a set of sockets needed a reliable network that could scale. So in '92, that was really because SAP is, the biggest ERP system out there, and it's, the main lifeblood of a company. If the network wasn't right, and then the client server architecture broke, and therefore the application broke. So that's why the need for the network for the creation of these sockets and these remote function calls, remote procedure calls, really was fundamental to SAP and really to the world itself. We saw the expansion of layer 2, layer 3 switching, routing. We evolved from a Cisco architecture of access, distribution, and core to a edge sort of distributed hub and spoke designs in on-prem. And there was sort of an evolution of data center architectures fundamentally for these client server applications like SAP. So the second sort of circle I wanted to call attention to was in 2021, the debut of RISE, which was a subscription-based, basically digital transformation as a service offered for S/4HANA. And also, and so why that I call attention to that is that's sort of the second inflection point of SAP. SAP fundamentally saw the value of cloud, the value of moving from a perpetual license-based model to a subscription-based model, really was sort of the next wave for SAP to add value, right? To add value to your data. So they saw the fundamental need for innovation, the fundamental need for this digital transformation to happen in the cloud. And for that to happen, SAP debuted their RISE offering, which was a subscription-based service to take S/4HANA, and whether you move to a SaaS offering or to a self-managed cloud offering, self-managed, I'll go into a little bit more detail, fundamentally adding value to your data through this digital transformation as a service became their driving focal point and their driving focus as a company itself. So those are the two sort of points I wanted to make, and this is sort of where we are, right? These subscription-based services are in the cloud. So now, what is that network to connect it together to give you that same client server model, that same ability to distribute and scale out services horizontally? So just like in '92, that same need for a network and a business critical network is happening now with the different subscription-based services that SAP offers, and really the need for data outside of SAP and the right network to connect into SAP becomes that much more important. So those are sort of two key points and kind of give you an idea of where we're at and sort of how we're at this beginning, or you know, if you look at the overall time, this 2021, 2022 time is really that beginning of those cloud services. So if you then want to decouple and break down S/4HANA into its component pieces, HANA stands for high-speed analytics appliance, right? So that's really the key to the HANA system, is this in-memory database. And the reason why HANA is better than its competitors, and some of the reasons why, you know, that it is so popular, is the fact that it is an in-memory database. So what ends up happening is either the servers on-prem or the cloud VMs, as Shahzad talked about, these individual 3-tier applications, the database itself are usually very large virtual machines. These could be hundreds of gig, even terabytes of memory that the database runs on. And what's unique about the HANA database itself is that, think of it as the data itself is in a row, and when you want to add attributes or information about the data itself, you're essentially add columns. So you could see how the data can grow and grow and grow, you know, very, very quickly. And what ends up happening is, because all the data is in one row and referenceable, it's very easy to find it and get it, but you obviously need a lot of memory to support this long string or long row of data, right? If you look at the competitors, you know, Oracle with NetSuite is a competitor, as well as Azure and AWS. They also have their own homegrown ERP system. Another sort of interesting point in the landscape of ERP systems is that Oracle databases will no longer be supported in 2025. I know there's been some talk of it moving to 2027, but fundamentally, you know, Oracle DBs, which were the DB portion of a SAP ERP system, that has to be HANA. It cannot be a third party. So that sort of, you know, creates a line in the sand where companies need to go through their digital transformation and be able to migrate to HANA. And then if you're going through an inflection point of, say, doing a migration to HANA, where are you putting it? Does it make sense to put it on-prem? Maybe it makes sense to put it in the cloud. So that's kind of another forcing function that is sort of stirring the pot and creating this sense of urgency to move to the cloud. At the top right here, when you look at the different components of the environment, you look at the digital core, which represents S/4HANA, and that's really the main, you know, center of gravity for this ERP system. And when we talk about, you know, how different services can connect into this core, you're looking at workforce engagement. So that includes SaaS offerings like SAP Fieldglass and SuccessFactor. If you look at how suppliers can access this S/4HANA, you're looking at Ariba and Fieldglass. If you look at customer experience, things like C4HANA, what was SAP Hybris that moved to C4HANA, you have the customer portion on the bottom right, and then on bottom left, assets, Internet of Things, you know, machines, robotics. That's what's called SAP Leonardo. And so those are sort of the four main components that connect into this digital core that that are the different SaaS services that are offered by SAP. On the bottom right, you kind of have a detailed high-level stack architecture of that three-tier application. So you have your Fiori shell, which represents the web tier. So you can have, Design Studio, you can have different Fiori apps, UI5 apps, and those connect into the ABAP system. Right, the ABAP system. ABAP is essentially the programming language that S/4HANA uses, and you have a gateway that then can make calls into the actual HANA system itself, and so that that does in-memory, compression, code push, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the idea here is it's again broken into those three tiers: UI or web application, and then the database and structures. So one of the other kind of interesting things is S/4HANA, and it's asked like, well, what does that acronym stand for? It's SAP Business Suite for HANA, right? So it's a kind of a little tricky marketing sort of name for the system itself. All right, so what are these components? And we talked about this, but I think it kind of helps to kind of double click on this a little bit. So at a minimum, there's three components. There's the Fiori web tier, there's the ABAP application server, the app tier, and then the SAP HANA DB tier. So what ends up happening is that a user can connect to Fiori or a third-party SaaS, and Fiori communicates to ABAP primarily over 80 and 443. ABAP is really what terminates that application and then does a set of RFCs or transports to the actual HANA DB. And that can be a range of ports in the 30,000 and 40,000 range. And the actual port and IP map to those sockets. And that's essentially, depending on the port, it represents the type of application that is exercising or speaking to the HANA system. So kind of breaks it up into three tiers, and there's sort of ways to connect into those systems as sort of illustrated here. So this could be both Fiori as well as third party or RISE or SaaS services that we showed earlier on the top right. Okay. So how do you get to S/4HANA? So there's a lot of, there's a couple of different options, and most companies have, one or more ERP systems. M&As are a huge reason why. You have companies that have mergers and acquisitions, and guess what? They have their own ERP system. And there's a lot of work, and customers I talk to, they can have 10, 20, 30, 40 different ERP systems. And the goal from the executives pushing down is for that to be collapsed into one ERP system. So for each ERP system, you have to kind of make a decision. Do I do a lift and shift to the cloud? Do I modernize? Do I move to something like a suite on HANA where I have any DB, and then when I'm ready, move to S/4HANA? Do I migrate to S/4HANA into the cloud, or do I migrate from on-prem, say R3 or ECC, which has those other third-party relational databases, to S/4HANA and then migrate to the cloud, to either the native self-managed or RISE offerings, right? So there's a couple of different options. The goal is, though, when you move, you have to have this idea of cleaning the core. You don't want to waste, processes, business processes. You don't want to have suboptimal or databases that are really bloated with old information or old processes. So there's things that you do to kind of prepare for that. And that starts with the Activate methodology. And that's sort of a 6-step phased approach using the Agile methodology to deploy quickly. And the other thing that SAP offers are model companies. These model companies are essentially pre-configured solutions for your industry. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, if you're in defense, there is a model company that represents the standard set of business processes that are common across all model companies. And you could use those, or you can use customized ones or some hybrid of those. And usually those model companies, those pre-configured solutions, are using SAP Best Practices, but they may not be right for you. So you need to do this, what they call a fit gap analysis, to kind of close in on the models that are coming available in the model company versus what your specific needs are. And the last I wanted to just touch on was the different sort of migration paths, right? You can go through a system convergence where you bring your business processes to a new platform. You can do what's called selective data transition, where you partly reuse and partly re-implement, so sort of a hybrid approach. Or you go to a new implementation where you have a completely new implementation where you're re-engineering all of your processes. You use this as an opportunity to clean your core, and when you move it to S/4HANA, either through the self-managed or RISE offerings, you have a clean core. It's been optimized for your business processes, and all of that sort of garbage or less used or suboptimal business processes are left on-prem and no longer used in your new S/4HANA deployment. So migration, there's migration cockpit. That's really the only way. And you have these three migration approaches, right? You can transfer the data using files. It's out of the box. It's pre-configured with these migration objects. The promise is that there's really no developer skill required, and it's a step-by-step guide to take the objects and map them across, right? So you can either transfer data using files, you can transfer the data using staging tables, or you can transfer directly. So these are sort of pre-configured migration content that helps you migrate your environment from on-prem to the cloud, depending on which method you decide. So one of the things I wanted to focus on here is go through the nuances of understanding self-managed versus a SaaS deployment. When you read through and go through SAP's documentation, SAP S/4HANA self-managed, they refer to it as on-prem. On-prem, though, can be either a physically on-prem, like your data center, or it could be your customers, or if you're an MSP, those specific cloud service providers. So it could be S/4HANA sitting in your subscription or your customer's subscription. And then so those are ones that really like to manage their own S/4HANA in their own accounts and subscriptions. They feel more comfortable. This is so business critical. It needs to be I need to have it managed in my environment. I don't necessarily trust or believe yet SAP is a true managed service provider that can handle all of the infrastructure. I want to manage the infrastructure. I want to own it, and I can use SAP and obviously engage with them on a consultative basis, but I want to understand that I want to manage it. I want it to be in my environment. So those are where the basis engineers manage that SAP S/4HANA infrastructure directly. The second is the SaaS deployment model. That's referred to as S/4HANA Cloud or S/4HANA SaaS. You may hear it. And those are deployments in SAP's cloud service provider account, not yours, or if you're a managed service provider, in your customers, right? SAP manages it. They manage the S/4HANA. The basis engineers are not as engaged, meaning they're not working as tightly with the infrastructure and the individual infrastructure. Most of that has been sort of delegated to SAP, and that's usually provided as part of your licensing model. So, typically as part of this migration, you're going through this perpetual or instance-based license to a subscription license, and the nuances of basis engineers and their involvement and SLAs and all that come into play. So if we dig a little bit deeper into SAP's S/4HANA self-manage, it's really about application high availability. And so if you look at the components of that in AWS, they have what's called an SAP lens for a well-architected framework. So if you're familiar with AWS in general, they have a well-architected framework which focuses on the same sort of building blocks of a well-architected framework, but in the context of SAP. So it's operational excellence, security, reliability, performance, cost, and sustainability. And what SAP Lens provides is insights into how what has been gathered from AWS, both the customers, the partners, and the SAP community in terms of what best practices those look like. And if you look to the right, these are examples of what they recommend for both the ABAP HA reference architecture with a link to it, as well as the AWS HANA HA reference architecture. And we're going to go into the details of the networking component. But if you look at it, it's your standard ASCS, which is your ABAP centralized server, that has an NQ replication across, right, with an overlay IP. And then with HANA, you have your HANA system replication, which is the clustering software with, say, Pacemaker and CoroSync, if you say you're using SUSE Linux, right? So those are those two sort of pieces. So this is the application layer, what that looks like, and then the database layer on the bottom. If you go to Azure, same thing, it's focused on HA, right? And to really achieve that, you have to, have redundancy for your application servers, redundancy for your databases, right? And so with these, you can have two or more instances, and they guarantee connectivity for these 3 nines, right? One instance they guarantee for 99.95%. When you have 2 or more, you can put them into what's called availability sets, and those are different fault domain structures that Azure offers. And similar to AWS Lens, Azure Center for SAP actually has in preview their acknowledgement and their sort of competition to AWS Lens is the Azure Center for SAP Solutions. So that's in preview now, but you can definitely take a look at it. And it goes through some of the similar things with AWS. It gives you best practices, it gives you references, it gives you, the list of instances that are SAP certified, what are the SAPs expected, the performance indicators for that environment. And with Google, Google's, in terms of popularity is probably third, which is why I have it listed here as third. And it's all about data, right? They still have the same, best practices. They have, the architecture. Their sort of spin on it is we want to decrease what they call time to insights and data warehousing costs with SAP data using things like Google's BigQuery. So their focus is on the data itself and being able to enrich it and look at all the AI, ML, and all the popularity of those types of services if you run SAP on Google. And so they also have their own SAP GCP reference, which is linked here. But if you look, the components are there fundamentally with what's internet enabled, what's trusted and private, backups. The infrastructure for all intents and purposes is pretty much the same. They just take a spin on it more with a data-centric view of what GCP value they offer. So now let's look at, we talked about self-managed, we talked about the AWS environment and what that looks like and some of the best practices and references. We looked at Azure, we looked at Google. Now let's look at the SaaS service types. So these are you know, the SaaS service types, and it kind of goes through these subscription or on-prem environments, right? So if you have you know, if you have S4 HANA, these updates with the multi-tenant environment, which is called Essential, you get automatic updates from SAP. If you use a single tenant version of their SaaS service, you could either have an automatic updates or you could have it manual. Sometimes when you want the single tenant edition, you want to try to combine the best of both worlds, where you don't necessarily want to be on the latest and greatest of what SAP offers, because that, you know, there's risk to upgrades, there's planning that needs to happen, and you usually want to have very tight control of that. The release cycles can be quarterly, semi-annual, or annual. So the amount of change and churn in your release cycles can be controlled by you, depending on if you want a multi-tenant, single tenant, or on-prem type service. And then with the service provider, cloud service provider, if you choose the multi-tenant, it's in SAP's environment, right? So there's really no choice. I think most of them are usually in Azure or AWS, depending on the service. And then the single tenant, the customer can choose. And if it's on-prem, you know, that also can be the customer's choice. Performance, the last sort of row, is really influenced by the overall system, the SaaS service itself. In the single tenant version, right, you're private. So you have a sort of a co-sharing or co-responsibility with SAP to do all of the tunings. And then if for the on-prem or self-managed, you know, it's all tuning is owned by the customer, and it's your responsibility to do that. So it kind of breaks down these different offerings. And there's a blog reference that kind of goes through these in more detail. So yeah, if you want to learn more, you know, here's a YouTube. There's a bunch of blogs on SAP's environment and on website, as well as you know, important things related to a basis monitoring and you know, more details on the SAP system, along with best practices and places to learn more.